on camera. That was my wife. Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome to somewhat of a modified version of the Tasting with Neil on a Friday evening. Modified because clearly Chelsea and Jason are here with me, and we're going to delve into the Primeur, which I think Jason will get into a little bit further down the line. But normally we do it live and with a group of people at the winery. But due to many things, we're not going to do that this time. We're going to do it here virtually. We'll taste the wines with you and talk about the harvest, et cetera, and Chelsea there at her house, and Jason looking like he's still at work, and me at home.
Somebody's got to hold things down out here.
Exactly. Someone's got to do the work, right? Chelsea and I were working on our backdrops here. And I will preempt this session with the fact that I'm probably going to have to cut out a little bit early to go and do another wine event. So I'll be turning it over to just Chelsea and Jason about 40 minutes in. So be warned. If you have questions for me, get them to me before then. Anyway, welcome. And as always with the stuff that I do, it is much more important that you ask questions than just sitting there listening to us talking, because we don't know what you want to know, and you will bring up good points that we have not thought of. So interactive is really, really crucial to this situation. I think we all agree on that. So Jason, you want to run with it?
Sure.
Welcome to my show, Jason, by the way. It's
pleasure. It's nice to be here. So basically Primeur is something that we've done for 2 decades now, but it is an outgrowth of a traditional way that Bordeaux was sold historically. And this goes all the way back to my dad back in the 1950s when he got his start at my grandfather's wine shop, and decided that there was an opportunity to offer these great first growth Bordeaux's to their customers before they even arrived on shore. And so he convinced my grandfather, who thought he was nuts, that this would never work. Nobody would ever pay for wine before they could get it, that they should put out an offer. He worked with the Bordeaux suppliers, including Chateau Lafite and Chateau Petrus, and really the big names in Bordeaux, to put together an offer describing what the wines were going to be like. And because people were able to do this in advance, that before, this was essentially a way for a winery to know what their sales were going to be before they ever had the wines in bottle. They were able to do it at a special price, and people got rewarded for their early acting in this. So they sold out the 3,000 cases that my dad had reserved from the growers in about 3 weeks. And a new way of selling Bordeaux was born in 1954. So he came up with this idea of doing the same thing at Tablas Creek with just our two top red wines, the Panoplie and the Esprit de Tablas, back 2 decades ago at this point, and we've been doing it every year. And normally we would do this, as Neil said, at an in-person event at around this time of year, those events are always really fun, but they only hit like maybe 100 people, and this year felt a little early to do an event that we thought would have to be indoors. I think we'll pick it back up again next year. But the thing that we've really loved about moving to these sorts of virtual events, not as a replacement for, but as a supplement to our in-person events, is that anybody who wants to do this can do it from anywhere. You don't need to be able to get to Paso Robles in mid-December to be a part of it.
I think it's pretty important that we notice how casually you mentioned that your father was the guy that created Bordeaux Futures, right? And we all are. I mean, it's like, oh yeah, Bordeaux Futures. That's a pretty remarkable thing that was created by your dad, and I can only imagine how astounded what a terrible idea his father must have thought that was, right? But still today, a very important part of the Bordeaux purchasing process, right?
It absolutely it is. I think he has sort of mixed feelings about what it became. He himself got out of the Bordeaux business after 1970, just because he thought that at this point it was an investment game rather than a wine lover's game. But yeah, it was the first of what turned out to be many innovations that he pioneered, of which what we're doing here at Tablas is just maybe the last.
Yeah, I mean, relentlessly so, and ideas that he had there with us. I mean, he would create things and start things that we would be going, I'm not sure about that, and didn't always work, but some of them became incredible ideas. Anyway, it just every time I sit and either I'm talking about it or I hear you talking about it, I think it's important that we remind ourselves, okay, yeah, that's not a small thing within our industry. That's a major thing that he created. Anyway.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. He generated more ideas per hour in the office than anybody I've ever worked with. And there were times where it could be completely infuriating because he would come up with this new idea that he was really committed to before you'd even had a chance to implement the last idea, which this just contradicted. But still, what an incredible basis for a business, or a series of businesses to know that you've got somebody who's going to come up with new ideas for you every week, every month. So Neil and I have been talking a lot. We have yet to really welcome and introduce Chelsea. Most of you probably know Chelsea Franchi, who's our senior assistant winemaker. But this is fun for a couple of reasons. One is that this was a vintage that Chelsea actually missed the harvesting part of it because she was on maternity leave. So your introduction to 2020 happened after the wines were in barrel when you came back. Maybe would you start by talking a little bit about what your thoughts were about 2020 as you came to experience it?
Absolutely. So I had a baby the first day we harvested fruit in August of 2020. I had the baby and then received word that we picked Viognier that day. So it's like, oh, Bodhi's a true harvest baby. So I would try to come in on Fridays just to see the team because I missed my work family tremendously, which I think really speaks volumes. But just to kind of keep somewhat of a touch of what was going on in the cellar and kind of see the fruit that was coming in and, kind of go through and taste the rosé with Amanda and kind of, taste some of the fermenting reds and smell the fermenting whites, and just kind of feel like I was still at least somewhat connected, even if I wasn't there on a day-to-day basis. And just going in and seeing the camaraderie that they had built with the harvest team in 2020 made me so excited to sit down for blending and try the 2020 wines, because I feel like when people enjoy working with each other that much, there's nothing but greatness that can come out of that vintage, because everybody's happy to be there and everybody's so excited to work together and work as a team and do things for other people and do things for the greater good. And I think that really, it shows through in the work that they did on these wines. So when when I came back to work in January and started kind of plotting through and just picking through the cellar.
Always think of Chelsea as plotting.
Well, you just kind of pick through and, like.
More of a skip, really.
It frolicking. Maybe frolicking is a better term.
Yeah, that's more appropriate.
Yeah.
I'd like to interject, though. I mean, I don't think we should overlook the importance of that moment. Selfishly for me, having had Chelsea there at my side since 2008 in that cellar, for her to suddenly not be there for harvest was not something that I didn't have to think about a lot. There's a lot of things when you work so closely with someone that you no longer have to think about. You just know they're getting taken care of, the rosé being one. You mentioned Amanda earlier, and Amanda had to take that over, and I had full confidence in Amanda. But nonetheless, there's things that I haven't looked at for over a decade because I don't need to, because I know Chelsea's looking after that side of what I do. So, I, not least with making sure I show up where I should be at the right moment. But anyway, I don't think people should underestimate that. It's a team we've worked together for a long time, and so to suddenly not have Chelsea there for harvest was very concerning to me leading up to the harvest. I will say that the team that we have built around us was so strong that it was not as hard as we thought. But anyway, that's the thought that's strong in my mind from 2020.
Well, one of my favorite moments was from you, Jason. A couple years ago, we were sitting outside having a picnic lunch with all of the cellar workers, and you came by with a tour. And you're like, "Oh, what's the occasion?" And we replied, "Oh, it's team building." And your comment off the cuff was, "Yes, obviously a team that is badly fractured and in need of repair." And that is perfect because it's so sarcastically wonderful, and yeah, definitely a unit. But when we sat down to do that initial tasting for the reds in April of this year, it was really my first chance, and a lot of people too. It's the first time that you sit down and taste everything in a lineup, because before you're just picking through and saying, we need to taste things that are finished, or we need to really focus on Syrah right now because that's likely finished, or let's go through and taste through Counoise. But to taste through the entire lineup, and Neil and I have talked about this before, where it can be an extremely stressful time, and it's really hard to talk to people and tell them, I had a very stressful day. I had to taste through 40 wines. People don't really connect with that, and it makes you sound kind of like a jerk. But if this is your job, is making these wines, and then you're laying your entire workload out in front of a group of people, and this is what we've been up to, this is what we've done, and this is what we have for the year, this is what we have to work with. It's scary and it's nerve-wracking. And I tasted through the 2020 wines kind of with like this whole fresh, I was tasting in vacuum because I didn't have all the experiences. And you're like, ooh, watch out for that Mourvedre, because that was a sticky trouble lot this year. I didn't have any of those preconceived notions. So it was both a little bit more difficult because you don't have these pre-built relationships with each of the lots, but it was also really fun and exciting because you're kind of tasting them like anyone else, where all of a sudden it's like there's new discoveries to be made, and just excitement around every corner. And they did not disappoint. It was I feel like there was so many times looking across the table at Neil and Craig in particular, and like, this is great. Which is cool because I didn't have that.
Awesome. Cool. Okay, so before we talk about kind of how the blending went, I want to talk a little bit about the harvest that led up to this. So I think we have a few little graphics that we put together. And by the way, it's Ian Consoli, who's our director of marketing, who's at the switchboard right now. So he's the one who's going to be filtering in comments and questions, adding some of the illustrations, pictures, and things that'll hopefully take you back to 2020. And so that will, I hope, put it in context a little bit. I see Richard's question asking to help with an understanding of how 2020 fits in with other recent vintages. So think back to 2020. I mean, this was not your normal year. We were growing these grapes under pandemic conditions. The winter before was kind of an unusual winter. It was quite cold. We'd had a string of very early beginnings to harvest. So beginnings to the growing season. So really early, starting in like 14 each year, 14, 15, 16, 17, we were seeing bud break in March. Everything was starting really early. And when we got to 2020, it was much later. And I think there's a rainfall graph that will illustrate this a little bit. So you can see the winter started out wet. We had a wet November and December. And then January and February were dry but cold. We had frosts like 15 nights each of those months, which is a lot. And then right at the point where we were really getting worried it was going to be a super dry winter, it started raining again in March. And those wet soils hold the cool better. And so you end up with a later bud break because the soils are so cool. So we basically had a late start to the growing season. And then a fairly cool first half of summer. The people who lived through this think of 2020 as a hot year because the end of summer was hot, but the beginning of summer was quite cool, including July, which was like 10% cooler than normal. So But by the time we got to August, and this graph starts basically at the beginning of August, you can see starting the beginning of August, that blue line is what the temperatures, the daily high temperatures were. The red line is what the daily average high is. So you can see that we had a lot more days that were warmer than normal than we did cooler than normal. We had a couple of heat spikes that got up above 110, which is really unusual here. 100 is not unusual. 105 isn't even all that unusual. 110 is really unusual. And then once you got to the beginning of September, we had an entire month and a half of above average high temperatures. And that really dictated the way that the harvest played out. It started a little late because we had that cool spring and a relatively cool first 2/3 of the summer. But once it got hot in August, it got hot and stayed hot. So we started a little bit late, we finished early, and we did what's normally a 9-week harvest in 6 weeks. It was intense, even not being directly involved in it. I can only imagine, Neil, what it felt like being in the middle of it. You're on mute.
Probably better for everybody. For me, they all seem pretty hot, to be honest. And once you're in harvest, once you're in the swing of harvest, you don't notice it so much. It's intense, and it's always intense, and it starts earlier or later, but it's never a huge difference to me. I found 20 was fast and furious, but again, you got a team of people and we're moving and we kind of enjoy it. I mean, honestly, if you've been working in a winery and working harvest and in a cellar for a number of years, as Chelsea and I have, and Craig, and if you don't like that intensity, you're going to go get a different job, because for us, it's the highlight of the year. And you're waiting for it to go, and you're waiting, and you're just hoping the weather sticks. When it gets, the times of year that are frightening for me are the springtime, when is it going to freeze, and am I going to lose crop? Are we going to lose shoots? And cold winters, January and February, that's good for us. It delays things a little bit. But it's that springtime moment when, if it freezes, we're actually going to lose crop, and we're going to have to go out and see wilted vineyard. That's the frightening part. Yeah, when it's really hot during harvest, because things can start coming in way too fast and getting riper than we'd like them to be, particularly with the style of what we do. We're looking for elegance, not super ripeness, so it can be worrying. I don't remember 20 being that way. I do remember it being hot, but honestly, it always feels pretty warm in Paso Robles to me. And then rain at the end of the year. That's the other one, when you've got more veg still hanging and it's about to be a rainstorm. That's when we get really nervous, I think.
Though 2020 had something that was unusual for us. Ian, do you want to put up the picture of what it looked like in early September?
Oh, God.
So California saw absolutely terrible wildfires in 2020. There were fires burning in Monterey County, in Sonoma, in Napa, in Mendocino, in Lake County. The ones that impacted us the most were the ones that were in Monterey County, in Carmel Valley. And this is what it looked like as we were harvesting in September. And I think there's one more photo which will show what it looked like under that smoke layer. So it's important to remember that where we were, that smoke was in the upper, middle atmosphere. It was really not at the surface. This is a picking day in early September, where you can see the smoke kind of hovering above the vineyard, but at ground level, it was actually the air was fresh, and it was one of those handful of days that were actually below those average highs, because the smoke was so thick that it blocked out the sun, and it topped out in the 70s instead of the days around it that were 90s or 100s. So when you hear about smoke issues in a vintage, usually it's because the smoke is at the surface and the compounds that the smoke brings adhere to the grapes and change the grape's flavor. And we were fortunate in that in 2020, those fires were far enough away that the smoke, by the time it got to us, had either had those compounds volatilize off, or it was up high enough in the atmosphere that it wasn't a big issue. So We were worried. We did. Richard asked, did we test for smoke compounds? We did, but we never found any that were at measurable levels, which we felt really, really grateful for.
The term old smoke and new smoke were things that I learned a lot about during that time, because we were very worried about it. Obviously, we were keeping a really close eye on it. And from all the research I did, as Jason's saying, smoke that has traveled a fair distance is going to have volatilized off a lot of the compounds that are going to be of trouble to us. And we didn't find any numbers of any concern in all our analysis that we did. We're
Thanks,
also
Al. We are too.
Grapes.
Yeah. And then finally, the way that the vintage played out, where it was somewhat dry but not super dry, and the rain that came late, cool the first half of the summer, hot the second half of the summer, it led to yields that were pretty uneven depending on the varieties. The early varieties that did the bulk of their ripening when the conditions were pretty benign actually had above average yields. Not hugely above average, but a little bit above average yields, particularly Grenache, which was fairly plentiful in 2020. As you got later and later in the harvest and the vines were having to do more of their ripening in that intense heat, the yields got lower and lower, and you could really see the vines struggling. You could see the Counoise and Mourvedre vines struggling, and we ended up with somewhat less Mourvedre and a lot less Counoise than we have in recent years. And so it's sort of, I think when you're wrapping your head around a vintage like 2020, it's important to remember the diversity that you get within the world of Rhone varieties. There are grapes that are much earlier and grapes that are much later and grapes that are kind of in the middle. And the story for the early grapes was really one of health and freshness. And the later grapes, it was kind of richness and lushness and density and softness. So it's there were lots of interesting components to work with as we started blending, in part because of that kind of two parts to harvest.
Hal had a good comment asking whether if it was the heat or the sun being blocked by the smoke. And I have a neighbor that works with vineyards up in the Monterey area, and they were extremely impacted by smoke last year, and they had a really difficult time ripening a lot of their kind of later white varieties that were just hanging on until November, just not really moving or going anywhere, because they just couldn't photosynthesize. They just didn't have enough sun to do anything. And it's always a tough question because it's agriculture and it's Mother Nature, and we can't really say, oh, it was the drought for sure, 100% it was the drought, or oh, it was a lack of sun because we had smoke. But I definitely think the combination of those two things, like the smoke layer, definitely was a factor. But the heat shut things down too. So it's I don't think it's ever really one thing. But Hal, that's a great point. It was multiple issues.
And the smoke was gone after just a few days. So it's not like their fires weren't burning anymore, but the way that the wind patterns worked meant that after that, like September 8th, 9th, 10th block where it was smoky enough to really cool things down, it was pretty sunny after that for the rest of harvest until we finished in mid-October.
Yeah, I mean, I think to agree with Chelsea, if there's anything I've learned, it's almost never one thing. It's always a combination. It's what happens in the springtime. It's the heat of the weather in the latter part of the year. It's always a combination of many things, not just in grape growing, in most things in life. It's usually a couple of factors that make something happen, good or bad.
And really hard to tease out what the impact is of any one of those
factors. You gotta look every year and try and learn a little bit that you can and apply it in the future if and when you can. It's such a beautiful vintage. I mean, tasting these wines, I haven't tasted them for a while, so this evening sitting here tasting the barrel samples has been pretty exciting. I mean, really beautiful, beautiful wines, which we'll get into. But.
Cool. Honestly, that's a good segue. We're probably ready to taste the first wine. And one of the really exciting things about this 2020 Esprit Red is that it is the first Esprit to have either Vaccarez or Sanso in it. Jazz hands from Chelsea. I love it. And these are grapes that are relatively new to us. Our first vintage on both of them was 2019. Obviously they're only 3 and 1%. It's only 4% of this wine. I don't want to make too big a deal out of their impact, but I think we should talk a little bit about what each of them brings.
I don't think you can say it's only 3% Vaccarez.
How would you say it?
It's 3% Vaccarez.
It's an amazing 3% Vaccarez.
I think it's huge. I think it's a huge step for us. I think to talk about them individually, I mean, I think Vaccarez was a surprise to all of us because if we're honest, there's very few people on this planet that know what Vaccarez is actually like. So when we first made it, it was a huge surprise because a lot of the lesser known varieties seem to be very pale and very light. And Vaccarez immediately was not that. It's darker and more structured and really pretty exciting. And I think we all felt from the beginning that this is going to fit somewhere in the Esprit. And it's been interesting to me learning, why, or not learning, but trying to surmise why are these varieties that were left behind. And it's pretty obvious with something like Terre Noire that, it's not a showy wine. It's pretty pale. It's kind of an oddball. I mean, the only thing with Vaccarez that I can think is it is really proven to be susceptible to mildew in the vineyard, which many years ago that would have been a lot harder to combat than it is these days with our better equipment, etc. But that I've been really impressed with. And Sanso, which I've always been a big fan of, but the Sanso that we have and what it does on our property, I think is some of the best that I've tasted anywhere. And I'm really, really excited about that. And I think it probably will see more than 1% further in the future. But just to see these wines coming together and the white also, and having all of these varieties and seeing a change in the complexity of the wine, to me is just so exciting.
So that, just to explain that last picture that we had up. So on the right, this is Dane, our shepherd. The small cluster is Syrah, which is a sort of a normal looking cluster. In his right hand to your left is Sanso, with berries that look like table grapes. And I think that's one of the things that Sanso is really good at. It's good at bringing, kind of opening up, taking a grape like Syrah or Mourvèdre that could be pretty dense and powerful and intense, and giving it freshness and lightness and brightness and vibrancy. And it has this lovely spice note. Oh, perfect. There's a question from Deborah. Yes, it has this lovely spice note, kind of sweet baking spices that is kind of conducive in anything that you put it in. And it's a grape that we're excited enough about that we've already planted another block and we have more on the way.
I think it's also important to note that what Sanso is by itself and its reputation, and we've made it on site for a year, but you never know what it's going to do within your blend, within the Esprit when you add it. You think but then when you start putting stuff together in the blend, and it brings other elements that you didn't expect that it was going to bring. That's my experience anyway.
Or even on your property. I mean, we've tasted Sanso from other producers, and you kind of have a general idea of what Sanso is. And then we get Sanso that's grown on Tablas Creek soils and produced in the Tablas Creek cellar. And it still has that Sanso idea where it just kind of puts a smile on anything that it comes in contact with. Like if it's single varietal Sanso, it puts a smile on my face. If you put it in a blend, it puts a smile on the blend. Like it just kind of elevates everything and just gives it a little bit more joy. And Vaccarez, I feel like, gives everything a little bit more muscle. But you're talking about only putting in 3% Vaccarez and 1% Sanso. But when we sat down to do that blending, Jason, we presented the initial 3 blends of Esprit. And it was a nearly unanimous decision that we chose the one blind blend that contained both Vaccaress and Sanso that we just kind of threw in as a wild card. Just thinking, well, you know what, this might be interesting. We'll still have a little touch for, some varietal experimentation if we do just this amount, but we'll just see what it feels like. And it was nearly unanimous.
It was. I went back and read my notes on the blending, but in anticipation of this the Zoom discussion, and one of the comments that I had in its aftermath is that it felt like a relatively easy blending, that we came to consensus fast, and that's not always the case. There are years where it's hard, where you have like maybe you start with 3 initial blends and you can eliminate one of the 3, but the other 2 each have like real reasons to love them, and it takes a while to figure out what the right path through that is. In this blending year, it felt like things came together and we settled on something pretty quickly, and we would brainstorm like, can we make this better? And we'd try a few things to tweak it and be like, no, that first one was really the best that we could have done.
You make those quick decisions and then you try and second guess yourself. Like, we didn't work hard enough for this. We should try some other things. No, you agreed because it was good.
Yeah. And I love thematically that this Esprit now has 6 of the 8 Chateauneuf varieties in it. So it has all of them except for Muscardin and Terre Noire, which we're hopeful in future years will develop enough intensity and complexity to make it in. But the other cool thing is that just this week we bottled the Esprit Blanc from 2020, which has all 6 of the white Chateauneuf varieties that are allowed.
Jazz hands.
Very excited.
So it's like we're getting closer and closer to, I think, what our initial kind of dream was about the Esprits, that the Esprits are kind of our riff on Beaucastel, like our translation of the ideas behind Beaucastel to this new place. And one of the things that makes Beaucastel what it is their commitment to using the full range of the grapes in Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And obviously, we're not going to do it until we feel like those grapes are ready to make a positive impact on the wine. It's not something to do just blindly, but like we're getting close.
I think that's an interesting question from Richard. Will the Vaccaress and Sanso affect approachability and longevity? It's kind of like they balance each other out on that front. So you have the Vaccaress that brings all that structure and a bit of austerity almost, and then to steal from Chelsea, the Sanso comes in and puts a smile on Vaccaress's face and that's the beauty of blending all these grapes together. I mean, it's not vastly different than Grenache and Syrah in a way. They balance each other out, and that's the goal of our blending, is to make that balance at the end of the day, is to take all these varieties and make them work as a cohesive team to make a beautiful bottle of wine. And no one's in charge. It's just such a good, and with these wines, with Age of Vine and Age of Us and our experience in blending, I suppose, I find them to be so, in this initial tasting, to be so seamless in how, even so young, that's kind of an impression that I get from these two today.
So
Ian, hold on, Chelsea. Ian, can you put the blend back up, the slide with the yeah, okay, go ahead, Chelsea.
Well, one of the things that I kind of wanted to touch on, because not a lot of people are familiar with Vaccaress. I know we've had the single varietal available for a little bit, but when we did our initial tasting of Vaccaress, just for people that haven't tried it or haven't totally been able to wrap their heads around it if they have had it single varietal, the initial tasting that we did with our varietal Vaccaress, Neil made a comment that if Tannat is a bodybuilder and it has this bulk and it has this like really structured muscle, then Vaccaress is an ultramarathoner, where it has the muscle, but it has kind of a leaner muscle. So it still has that energy, that bright acidity that Tannat carries, but it's much leaner. It's much more energetic, I think. And I think I think about that description every time I have single varietal Vaccaress, because I think it really kind of brings everything together and kind of helps me understand the grape a little bit better. So to Richard's question, asking if this is going to help with longevity, I think absolutely. Just kind of put things in context for people that aren't as familiar with Vaccaress.
I love that descriptor. I love it's kind of sinewy in a.
Yes.
Like,
I don't think I actually said that, did I? That doesn't sound like something I'd say. Sounds like something Chelsea would say, not me.
So we've spent a lot of time talking about Vaccaress and Senso, which are, I think, exciting and amazing and awesome. But this is 96% from the grapes that we've used in the Esprit over the last 20 years since we started making it. So this wine is always based on Mourvèdre. It's been anywhere between 35 and 57% Mourvèdre over the years. About 2/3 of the time, Grenache is the number 2 variety. The other third of the time, it's Syrah, and it's really a question of what the Mourvèdre needs. In general, in a vintage where the Mourvèdre is a little on the lighter side, it needs more Syrah, which is going to bring in darkness and density. But in general, in the best vintages, we would prefer Grenache to be the number 2 because it adds kind of juiciness and vibrancy and plushness without dominating the structural elements. If you have a lot of Syrah, it can dominate the feel of the wine, particularly when it's young. So based on Mourvèdre's chocolatiness and richness and meatiness and dark red fruit, then Grenache for the brightness and kind of purple fruit and good acid and sweet spices. Syrah is the power and structure and tannin, and dark like smokiness. And then Counoise is very much like Senso. It's kind of the thing which makes everything else laugh. It's low in alcohol. It's got a little more acid. It's got lots of good spice, lots of good fruit, and it helps open up the tighter, more closed varieties. So that's the story on the Esprit.
I
know Neil has to leave in the next.
Giving you a 10-minute warning here, I guess.
Yeah, let's. I mean, we will absolutely. Chelsea and I are going to stick around. We'll take lots of questions, but I want to give Neil a chance to talk about the Panoplie before he has to go. So,
I need to get something.
Can you put up the info on the?
A little more straightforward, isn't
it? Yes, there's only 3 grapes. We have a few times included Counoise. I think twice we've included Counoise in Panoplie, if I remember my vertical tastings right. But it's always overwhelmingly Mourvèdre, always been over 50%. And it's modeled after the Hommage à Jacques Perrin, which is the wine that Beaucastel makes that is done in honor of kind of the patriarch of the Perrin family who brought the estate to the status that it is now in the years after World War II. And he was the guy who my dad first worked with, first became friends with in the Perrin family, and the one who trusted my dad enough as a still relatively young importer to let him use Beaucastel to introduce America, not just to Beaucastel, but to kind of the whole category of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And Mourvèdre was his love, the grape that he had reintroduced to Châteauneuf-du-Pape in the 1950s after it had been lost there. It hadn't been planted there in about 50 years because it was lost due to phylloxera. And he got his Mourvèdre cuttings from friends who run the family that runs Domaine Tempier in Bandol, which is kind of the mecca for Mourvèdre for, I think, most lovers of the Rhone. So that's kind of the idea behind the Hommage. And the Panoplie is our take on the Hommage. So it's the best 5%, more or less, of what comes into the cellar, and done to show off what we love about Mourvèdre, that meatiness and richness and dark red fruit and chocolatey mocha character. So that's my idea behind it. How Neil, what do you think of when you think of Panoplie? What makes a lot Panoplie to you?
Before I do that, I mean, every time you mention Jacques Perrin, I think I have to mention and think about how important. Obviously, I never met the man, but how important he was to what we are. I mean, he's the one that started farming organically and thinking about biodynamics. He's the one that brought Mourvedre back to the table. Things that we're completely based upon. I mean, if I can tell you two things that were hallmarks of the beginning of Tablas, is organic farming and Mourvedre, which came directly from that man, which I think is remarkable. And then your dad going there, persuading him to let him bring, and persuading him to build a cellar to store bottles so he could bottle all of the stuff at once and not one. I mean, what a history, that is, I don't know. It's just always impressed me what he did. And at a time when he was swimming completely against the tide, because late 50s, the chemical farming was the thing, it was the answer to everything. And he just saw that it wasn't going to end well. And he did it, which is not this. You can see why your dad and him kind of, I assume they got along, why they got along, because they were prepared to go against the grain of everybody else. And I think that's just such a cool part of what we are and who we are.
And the other piece, which I think is really central to who we are, is that he was the one who saved a lot of those obscure Rhone grapes from extinction. Went and found where they had survived phylloxera because they had been planted in soil that had a high enough sand content that phylloxera couldn't get itself established, and brought them back and grafted them onto the new rootstocks that were developed after World War II and planted them in the vineyards of Beaucastel.
Well, think about it. I mean, as we struggled with your dad's crazy ideas, there were people when Jacques was saying, no, we're going to do Vaccarès and Terre Noire. We're going to do Mourvedre instead of Grenache. Someone was going, no. That's what I love.
Sure, you're right.
Both men, that's cool. Anyway, Panoplie, it's usual that and we talked about this before we went live, it's usual that I prefer the Esprit to the Panoplie at this moment in time. But I don't know today. I think the Panoplie is showing incredibly well. I mean, it's still very broody, and there's a lot that it's yet to give for sure. But the tannin structure, the richness of the tannin, there's no dryness. It's a big fella for sure, but the ageability is not in question. But it's beautiful right now out of the bottle. It's just so impressively. Kind of not big. I hate the term is big, but it's powerful, but without being showy about it. There's an elegance to it which I really like, and it's almost like the Esprit is the one that needs to calm down a little bit in this flight to me.
And I think Mourvedre has this misplaced impression of being a difficult grape, like it's somehow feral and dirty. And certainly there are examples where it ripens late. There are examples where it was picked where you could taste the green tannins. If it was fermented in a cellar that wasn't clean, it is certainly provides a happy home for weird microbial stuff. But in and of itself, if you get it right, Mourvedre is lovely. I mean, it's kind of dark and plush, and like it's red fruited, but really dark red fruited. And it's got this chocolatey, loamy, earthy character that I think is gorgeous. And this is the most excited that I've been about a Panoplie since 2007. And it is a really like luscious wine, but it is not a heavy wine, not a one-dimensional wine at all. It's got brightness, it's got depth, it's got structure, but it's really lovely. And I'm like Neil, I often don't love the Panoplie when it's been in barrel for a year. Like I can sense what it's going to be, but it's not something that I taste and think, wow, that's delicious. But in 2020, it's delicious.
I hate this, but I wish I could take you all in the Uber with me. But that might be weird. I'm going to have to step out and leave this in your capable hands. And I'm sorry to have to do this, but such is life. Busy life. The challenging life of a winemaker.
So we will move on to the tasting with. We'll move on to the tasting with Neil without Neil portion of the event.
Exactly. Tasting sans Neil.
Cool. Thanks, Neil.
All
Have a
right.
good dinner tonight.
Great to see everybody. Thanks everyone for being here. Tasting with, or whatever it is, with Neil on a Friday. We'll be back at some point. We're not sure when yet, but enjoy these wines, and they are beautiful. And I don't say that about every wine that we make. They're all great. These were beautiful wines. They really are. All right, enjoy the rest of your time. I'll go struggle through the rest of my evening.
Bye, Neil. Have a good weekend.
So, Chelsea, talk about what is Panoplie? What signifies a Panoplie lot to you when we're sitting around a blending table?
So when we sit down and do the red blending, we taste everything blind, and we do everything by variety. So we don't know what lot it is, but we know that we're tasting Mourvedre, and then we know that we've moved on to the Grenache, and we know that we've moved on to Syrah and so forth. So when you're tasting each of these individual varieties, and then within those, each of these individual lots of varieties, we rate everything a 1, 2, or a 3. So a 1 is going to be something that it's plush and it's elegant and it's got some power and it's got just this assuredness of itself. Like that's something that you could bottle up from a barrel sample and take home that evening and enjoy it with a meal. It's just that complete and beautiful. A 2 is usually something it's really really pretty and juicy. It's got nice acidity. It's got a good playfulness, but it doesn't have the gravity that we're looking for from a 1. It maybe doesn't have the expansiveness or the complexity, but it's still really fun. And sometimes those are great things for even varietals or coat. And then a 3 is usually something this is something that we might need to dog ear and come back to in the cellar. Maybe it's not finished fermenting yet. It's still a little bit sweet. Maybe it's got some spritz or some cloudiness to it. This is just something that we kind of know if we mark it as a 3, we need to come back to that and give it a little extra love. So when we start doing the blending trials, when we start with Panoplie and we start with Esprit, we're looking at all of the 1s because these are the lots that we know these are something special. Usually during these tastings, we'll have something that's a 1+ or a 1 star, or everybody has their own way of marking their exceptional lots. But it's interesting because when you get to those lots, everybody just kind of gets quiet. And these are basically just lots. And sometimes we'll just do barrel select. So even if it's an 8-barrel lot, we might just pick 1 or 2 barrels from that lot to go into Panoplie because we'll go through and say, this is the barrel. This is the one that carries all of that richness, all of that expansiveness, all of that gravity that we're looking for. So Panoplie for me is something that it has everything, but it needs it in balance. It needs the acidity, it needs the plushness, it needs the tannin, but it needs to all be kind of working in symphony. You can't just have something that's really powerful and wow, that's a lot of tannin and my mouth is toast for the rest of the tasting. That's not a Panoplie lot. But I think, when you taste these lots, it's just, that it's something special. And those are a little bit different because they're bigger than Esprit lots, because sometimes Esprit tends to have a little bit higher acidity, and just a little bit more of that high-toned energy than the Panoplie might have, where the Panoplie has more roundness. And I taste these now, and I think we nailed it. There's so much differentiation between these two, despite the fact that they're both driven by Mourvedre. But the Panoplie definitely has much softer edges, but it's unfurled in a way that Esprit still has kind of that tight energy and a little bit harder edges at this point in the game, at least, which I think is really cool and beautiful. But it has we talked earlier about this, it has a chewiness to it. Like there is a texture to the Panoplie in particular that's like the tannins are chewy and everything just has this full mouth experience that's it's you don't drink Panoplie when it's this young, but this one you can, and I think this is going to be a really, really fun experience 5 years down the road too.
I agree with that 100%. I think it's worth explaining what Panoplie means, like the actual word. So it's a medieval word. that is essentially the same word in both French and English that means a knight's full regalia. So it's like not just the chest plate and the shield. It's like when you are totally decked out for a tournament or for a, what can you say, a fancy battle, like whatever, like the when you need to be fully decked out. That was a knight was in his panoply. The panoply was the full collection. You can think of it a little bit as like cornucopia. Like, yes, it means a horn of plenty, but it more generally has come to mean like the collection of all of the things you might want. And panoply is the same idea, except like medieval knight version. So
it's the coolest word.
Yeah. So it really is the best of the best. And we make normally somewhere in the like 600, 700, maybe 750 cases range. So it's very selective to get into it. And how good the panoply is so determined by how good the Mourvedre is in that year. Like, you can't hide it. Like, it is a Mourvedre led, Mourvedre dominated, Mourvedre expressed wine. And the Mourvedre that we had in 2020 was the strongest collection of Mourvedre that I can ever remember. And I don't have my notes from blending back in a year like 07 or 09, which I know were really powerful, really intense vintages also. But we had, of the Mourvedre lots, I think we had 12 lots, and I gave 8 of them ones, which is like super unusual. That's not the way that it normally goes. It's normally about a third ones and about like whatever 50 or 60% twos, and then a few threes sprinkled in here and there. And this was not that. This was like one great Mourvedre lot after another, to the point that I remember looking around the table and everybody looking at each other like, am I doing this right? Like, can we give them all ones? Like, that's not supposed to be possible.
It both makes blending a lot easier and a lot more difficult if everything is a one.
Luckily, not luckily, but Mourvedre was scarce in 2020. So if it's going to be scarce, it's really good that it be high quality, because like, you're not going to have a lot of it. And we want to be able to make both Panoplie and Esprit, which are Mourvedre led wines. And if you don't have a lot of Mourvedre, it had better be good, or else we're going to have a lot of trouble putting together those blends in a way that makes sense.
So Richard had a question about Panoplie coming from Scruffy Hill. Jason, do you want to take that one?
I think you might actually know the answer better than I do. I mean, I feel like there's always a little bit of it that comes from Scruffy Hill, but it's not dominated by that particularly.
No, so the Scruffy Hill lots are perennial, like they're perennially some of our favorite lots for all of the varieties that we grow over on that plot of land. So that's really our most important dry farmed piece of our property at Tablas Creek. And the majority of that will typically go into the Engoblet. But usually we will kind of pull off barrels here and there of each variety to go either into Panoplie or Esprit, because they're so beautiful. And I think they are really the most true expression of our property and what Tablas Creek is all about. I feel like Scruffy Hill lots, more than any other lot that we have in our cellar year in and year out, are so markedly Tablas Creek. So it's always kind of nice to have a little bit of that in the Panoplie or Esprit, but most of it goes into Engoblet.
And I think it's important also to note that in general, the wide space dry farmed blocks like Scruffy Hill, they tend to make wines that are incredibly expressive, but they're not usually the most powerful wines that we taste in our lineups. And with Panoplie, we really want that plushness of texture and density to the wine. And a little bit of the Scruffy Hill component is really helpful because it does make it more expressive and it opens it up a little bit. But it is really the closer spacing and the competition that you put the vines through that gives you that extra layer of intensity. And we like a balance between the more intense lots and the more powerful lots, and then the lots that are more expressive. It's always a balance between the two. But in Panoplie in general, it tends to weight a little more towards the lots that are more powerful. And that means that we probably are not ever going to have this wine be 100% from those dry farm blocks, or at least not until the vines get really quite old.
Excellent question, Bill.
luckily, we have never had a vintage where the Mourvèdre just didn't make it. I mean, there are years in France where like it starts raining in the end of September and the Mourvèdre is not ripe and it never comes. Like it never lets up enough that you can bring your Mourvèdre in. That's never happened, thankfully. But there have been years where we only had enough top-rated Mourvèdre to make a smaller amount of Esprit and Panoplie. So there's a couple of things you can do. In Panoplie, like you've always just got to pick the best of the best. And there's always been enough to make the amount of Panoplie that we want in a way that we like. You can get extra plushness from, or extra density from Syrah, but you can only do that to a certain extent before the Syrah starts to take over. So there have been a few years where we've used more Syrah and Panoplie. And this vintage has a decent amount of Syrah in it, but you can't be too much or else it starts to dominate. So in the Esprit, you have a little more room to play with. You can have it be a little more Syrah, a little less Mourvèdre. There have been years where it's only been like 35 or 40%, 35, 36, 37% Mourvèdre, where you use more Grenache and more Syrah to put the blend together. But we don't really have that option in Panoplie. And so far we've been fortunate that it's always been there, with the exception of one vintage, 2001, where we had a bad frost in the spring and ended up deciding that we didn't have the Mourvèdre character and expressiveness and intensity to make either Esprit or Panoplie. We didn't make either of them in 2001. And if we were faced with a similar situation, we'd make the same decision. If it's not there, we don't make the wine. But thankfully, in Paso Robles, the really disastrous vintages are very few and far between.
I would like to jump in right here and say, as somebody that works on the cellar side and the blending side and production side, to work for a winery, with Bill's question asking, well, what happens if you don't have enough high quality Mourvèdre? Because I work for a winery that doesn't say, this is how many cases we need to make it work. We either will change the blend because it's not a formulaic blend. It's Morpheus and it changes from year to year, given the vintage characteristics that we experience that year. And it's the Esprit and Panoplie are there to tell a story. They're not there because this is what Esprit is and this is what Panoplie is and this is what it's always going to be. But I think, speaking to the quality of the company that I work for in the winery, one of the most important things is if we don't have the quality, then we'll either make less or we won't make it. Which for me, working on the side that I work on, it's really, really great. It's really cool. And luckily, because I work on the production side, we haven't had that issue, because that would be a whole other can of worms. And I don't even want to think about what would happen in that situation. But it is a really nice thing. If we, the year that we had wild boar come through and eat nearly all of our Viognier, and Viognier is our top grape for Côte de Tablas Blanc. And we had to get very creative with how we made Côte de Tablas Blanc that year. And
we made a lot less.
We made a lot less. So there's, I don't know. I think that's really cool.
And that's one of the things that I think is it's an important thing to understand about the way that we think about particularly Esprit. The Esprit is for us the expression of what we love about that vintage through the lens of a wine led by Mourvèdre. So it's not that it's supposed to taste the same as it did the previous vintage, because the vintage wasn't the same. The raw materials we had weren't the same. The blend should not be the same. And in fact, the times where we've ended up with a very similar blend to what we had the year before, it always makes me very suspicious. Like, were we really looking at this objectively? Because it's not the same. You shouldn't end up with the same solution if you don't start with the same question. And you don't ever start with the same question. Each vintage is different than what you got the year before. So the blending trials are always the times where we start to put a personality to a vintage, and then try to make sure that that personality, the best facets of that personality, are what we're showing in the Esprit.
Absolutely. Mark, we did not. Neil spent many a night posted up on Text Hill, and he was unsuccessful. So the wild boars made it through to another season.
Yeah, that was tough. I mean, we ended up, the only way we found was like fill the holes that they dug under the fence with pointy rocks and just make it uncomfortable to get into the vineyard and hope they'd eat somebody else's vineyard. Like we were never able, like we tried, we posted people up there with rifles and we tried, we're unable to even do anything other than like maybe scare them off a night or two.
We did. The people we posted up with rifles were Neil and Levi, though. So I don't really think those wild boar were in any danger. But at least we could say we were making an effort.
Cool. Okay, we are an hour in here. I want to wrap things up in the next 5 or 10 minutes or so. I do have a few questions for Chelsea, but anybody else who has questions for us should lob them in sooner than later, so that we make sure we get to them. But so Chelsea, if you had to come up with like a comparison for 2020, do you have a vintage that you would compare it to?
That's always such a difficult question because each vintage is so unique because of everything that happened on the way leading up to that bottle of wine.
No is a perfectly acceptable answer. This is not. I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's funny. You were talking about you haven't been this excited about a Panoplie since 2007, and 2007 to me was just a blockbuster vintage. I mean, so powerful and just like a little scary in its youth, and now it's really, really impressive and gorgeous. But we followed up 2007 with that 2008 vintage, and 2008 to me just had this prettiness, and it had this elegance, but it had this depth, and everything was in equal measure. And everything seemed to be, a little bit more than usual, but so even across the board. It was just a delight and a joy to drink. And there are parts of that vintage that I think speak to me through these glasses. I mean, obviously this is its complete own unique experience, but there is a delight that I found with the 2008 that I'm getting from this vintage as well.
I've always loved the 2008s. They got overshadowed at the time because they were stuck between 07 and 09, both of which were like Arnold Schwarzenegger on either side. I mean, they were massive, massive vintages, but the 08s have turned out to be just lovely and so expressive.
Yeah. Do you have a comparison?
So it's actually, the solutions that we came to in the blending are not very different from the solutions we came to in 19, this vintage feels to me a little lusher, a little less structured than 19. But overall, if you all have been, anybody out there has been trying the 19 and loving it, I feel like this is going to be in that vein more than it's like, say, 16 or 17 or 18. But the closest comp for me would be to go all the way back to 03, which I know that was before you were working at Tablas, but
we were pouring it when I started.
Yeah. So it was a vintage where it was a little bit like 08 in that it was in between 02, which was really big and dense and dark and structured, and 04, which was, I remember Francois Perrin describing it as very square. Like it was a vintage with very like architectural features to it. Like you felt the structure. 03 was like sunny and beautiful and friendly. And I think we all underestimated it because it was so appealing in its youth that we sort of dismissed it next to its more structured neighbors. And then I think for the last 15 years, every time we've done a vertical tasting, we're like, man, that 03 is amazing. And I feel like that's for me 2020. It's got so much appeal and juiciness and friendliness that I think people are going to love it on site. But that shouldn't take away from the fact that I think it's got structure and it's got balance, and it's something which is going to be beautiful over the long term. So that's probably my closest comp. But like you said, it's its own thing. Every vintage is its own personality.
It makes me really want to get back into my deep cellar and pull out an 03 now.
I don't think you're going to be disappointed.
I don't think so either.
It's one of those years that, like, every time we open it, we're like, oh wow, like
yeah.
Cool. Okay. There are a couple of things, just a couple of like housekeeping pieces. First of all, we are still pouring these wines for the next couple of days in the tasting room through this weekend. We've been doing it for the last like 3.5 weeks. So if you are local and you do want to try these wines, you come out to the tasting room this weekend. We'll have them available as extra pours. But that ends on Sunday. And then if these are wines that it sounds like you would like to order futures of, we have the futures information up online. We have a printable PDF form. Ian, can you share the link to that? Great. Okay, it's in the comments. So that has the link to the forms. It also has more information about the vintage and about the wines and about the Primeur program. And there is a blog that we wrote a few years ago talking about Primeur and sharing a little more of my dad's history with it, including something super cool, which I should have thought to put together an image for. But we still have the original like hand colored lithograph. So it's a lithograph, but with like watercolor. That was the offer that my dad had a French artist put together to send out to all of the mailing list members of M. Lehman, my dad's shop. That was the one that produced the whatever that first ever Primeur and sold out in a month. Have you seen that, Chelsea? Have I shared that with you?
I have seen it, but we should bring it out again.
See if I can find it.
Yeah.
It's probably in one of these shelves. I'm sitting in my dad's old office, so it's in probably in one of these shelves. Cool. Well, that is I think the show. So any final words, Chelsea?
Thank you so much for hosting this, because now I have something to drink on a Friday evening and share with my family. But yeah, this was such a treat, and pulling these samples the other day just made me so excited for this vintage all over again. We do this as a job, but it's so much more than that. I mean, it's you work with these wines that are just, it's such an honor. So thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for letting us play with these beautiful pieces and components and having this beautiful product to share with our families. I work there, and I'm so excited to share this tonight.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you, Chelsea, for hanging out this Friday evening. Thank you, everybody who joined us. Thank you for your questions and comments. They were great. And yeah, tune in to Neil's Tasting with Neil. We'll kick that back off in January. If you want to hear more from me, I do Instagram live conversations every other Wednesday. I have Marta Mendonça, who is the executive director of Porto Protocol, which is one of the leading international organizations in helping the wine community fight climate change. She's going to be my guest this coming Wednesday. So noon Pacific Wednesdays for that. And then, of course, Fridays at 5:00 Pacific for these Tastings with Neil. So on behalf of Neil, the Tasting with Neil without Neil, and Chelsea, thank you all for joining us tonight. It's been a pleasure.
Bye, everybody. Have a good weekend.